Professor Eske Willerslev is staring at a tooth like it is a confession. It is not a shiny crown or a weapon, just a piece of bone that survived while the rest of history rotted away. He holds the evidence of a Viking in his hands, and the stereotype inside his head starts to crack. The DNA inside that tooth does not match the movie poster. It does not match the blonde, pale warrior everyone expects. Here is the penalty for not knowing what comes next. You will keep picturing Vikings as one look, one bloodline, and one simple story. The reward for staying is that you will see why the world's largest Viking DNA study blew that story apart, and why the most shocking detail was so ordinary. Brown hair. Before this study made headlines, pop culture had already turned the Viking into a costume. Blonde hair, blue eyes, the same rugged face repeated 1,000 times. The problem with costumes is that they replace real people. Eske Willerslev stepped into that noisy myth with a quiet weapon: whole genomes, meaning big chunks of DNA pulled from the densest parts of ancient bones and teeth. In 2020, his team examined genomes from 442 Viking age skeletons across Europe and Greenland. That is not a handful, that is a crowd. Crowds are messy, and they do not behave like a single family. When Eske looked at the data, the blonde stereotype started to feel like a fairy tale. The genomes showed notable admixture, meaning mixing, from outside Scandinavia, including Southern Europe and Asia. Those outside inputs brought in pigmentation variants, the tiny genetic changes that affect traits like hair color. Brown hair became common in the sample. That one detail is the click moment. It is not exotic or mystical. It is exactly why it hurts the stereotype. It says the classic Viking look was not the rule, but a selective memory. This study forces us to watch a new drama about ancestors. These ancestors are not kings on a family tree. They are the streams of people flowing into Viking life, shaping what a Viking could look like. The first mini-drama is about who gets counted. Archaeology gives you graves and objects, but DNA tells a different story. In this study, analysis of whole genomes showed that some Vikings in burials lacked Scandinavian DNA entirely. That means a person could be placed in a Viking burial, treated as a Viking in death, and yet not carry Scandinavian ancestry. Think about the choice behind that. A community chooses who belongs. Sometimes that choice is made through blood, but sometimes it is made through life, lived together, work shared, and risks taken. The consequence is that the word Viking becomes bigger than born in Scandinavia. It blows up the false belief that Viking is a strict genetic category. The genomes suggest it was also a role, a community identity, and a social label. To understand this, we have to look at the Salme boat burial in Estonia. This is where the story stops being about statistics and starts being about a family. In a mass grave, researchers found 4 brothers. They were full siblings, laid in a Viking boat burial around 750 CE. Their bones show violent death, and the timing points to the same day. No slow sickness, no long decline, just a sudden end that left them in a mass grave with weapons. If you do not keep watching, you will keep picturing Vikings as lone wolves, fierce strangers who show up out of nowhere and vanish. The reward here is more personal and frightening. These men were not random, they were family. The rest of the boat's 41 occupants had near identical ancestry from one small village, meaning this was not a mixed crowd of adventurers. It was a tight-knit group who trusted each other enough to sail into danger together. Before these brothers became the Salme Vikings, they were just sons in a place where the name Salme meant nothing. Their home ties back to mid-Sweden, the Mälaren region. They were born into a village where people knew their parents and their place in the chain of daily life. In a small village, your name is not just yours, it belongs to your family. Your behavior reflects on your brothers. When these brothers left, they carried the weight of everyone who would be judged by what they did. They joined a raid, not a solo trip. The DNA from their petrous bones, the part of the skull that holds genetic material best, reveals that the raid was built on trust. Trust keeps you alive in a fight. A brother is less likely to abandon you than a stranger. A neighbor is more likely to understand your signals. But that same network creates a hidden danger. When a raid fails, it can wipe out an entire slice of a community. It is not just that men died, it is that the men from this one village died. The 4 brothers died violently on the same day. The choice to go together meant they fell together. Their family did not lose a son, they lost 4 at once. This counters the stereotype of raids being groups of strangers thrown together by greed. The data suggests raids could be family-based expeditions where the core raiders stayed genetically homogeneous. Sometimes, a Viking raid was a village on the move. Now we shift the camera to Orkney, Scotland, to meet a different kind of protagonist. Here, archaeologists found a man buried with a sword at his side and an axe close enough to grab. Coins were placed with care. The grave looked like a message meant for the future. This man was a Norse warrior. If you walked past that burial with a notebook, you would have written Viking without hesitation. Then, about 1,000 years later, scientists did something no grave good could stop. They took DNA from his skull and teeth. They read the code he carried from birth, and the code said something that made the burial look like a lie. This Viking had no Scandinavian ancestry. His ancestry matched modern Irish and Scottish profiles. This is the moment where the ground shifts. If a man can be buried like a Viking warrior without Scandinavian ancestry, then Viking cannot mean Scandinavian in a simple way. It means a role, a culture, and a way of life that locals could adopt. It means you could be born in Orkney, have roots tied to the Scots and Picts, and still be seen as Viking enough to receive the full warrior burial. That is not a small correction. It changes the story of power and belonging. The grave tells you what people wanted to show. The DNA tells you the heritage. The gap between them is the human truth. This man lived in a world where identity was not a badge you bought in a shop. It was a dangerous label that decided who stood with you and who fought beside you. In Orkney, someone chose to give him a full Norse-style warrior burial. That choice matters because it means the people around him accepted him. He raided, he sailed, he learned the customs, and he paid in risk. The sword and axe were not placed there by accident. He died a Viking in the eyes of the people who buried him. His bones force us to stop treating history like a simple family tree with clean branches. He shows us a world where locals could adopt Viking culture without ethnic replacement. But the surprises in the DNA data do not stop with individual graves. The 2020 study revealed a massive pattern about the Vikings back home. Pop culture loves to paint Vikings as a single, connected network. Bands of raiders from everywhere mixing together like a roaming nation. That image is tidy, but the DNA says it is wrong. The project showed that inside Scandinavia, the groups were more separated than people expected. Danish Vikings stayed mostly Danish, Norwegian Vikings stayed mostly Norwegian, and Swedish Vikings stayed mostly Swedish. There was minimal mixing between those big groups, even while they were raiding across Europe. This creates 3 distinct mini-dramas based on geography. The Danish Vikings faced a problem of proximity. England was just across the water. Their choice was to target the British coast. The consequence is that Danish lineages cluster in that direction. Norwegian Vikings faced a different horizon. Their route pointed toward Ireland, Iceland, and Greenland. They moved along a chain of islands, keeping their group distinct. Swedish Vikings focused on the Baltic, moving east. The result is that Viking was not one giant brotherhood. It was a set of parallel streams. A Danish leader did not need a Swedish stranger if he had cousins and neighbors he could rely on. Trust was the currency, and trust is local. The genetic isolation persisted despite external influences. This leads to the sharpest irony of the whole story, the one that makes modern people blink. We tend to think that modern Scandinavians are the purest version of the Vikings. We think the farther back you go, the more clean and Nordic the bloodline gets. The DNA says the opposite. Viking Age Scandinavia was likely more diverse than present-day Scandinavia because it had stronger outside input. The Viking Age was a time of movement that did not ask permission. People came in from the British and Irish Isles, from southern Europe, and from the eastern Baltic. Captives were taken, partners were brought home, and traders stayed. Each of those people brought DNA that entered the gene pool. British-Irish ancestry appears clearly in the data linked to raids and returns. Southern European DNA entered through trade routes and slavery. Eastern Baltic and Uralic influences flowed into places like Gotland and northern Scandinavia. Gotland acted as a hub, a busy station where goods and people mixed, amplifying diversity. So, what happened? Why does the modern gene pool look more uniform? The answer is the slow, quiet force of history that happens after the shouting stops. Later, medieval shifts reduced these non-local components. People started marrying within their local circles again. This process, called endogamy, diluted the outside lines over centuries. The consequence is that a modern Swede or Dane might carry less of the exotic, non-local DNA than their Viking ancestor did. The pure Viking is a myth that erases the very thing that made Vikings famous: movement. They traveled, and the world traveled back with them. They were not a sealed bubble, they were a crossroads. Eske Willerslev and his team did not just sequence bones, they dismantled a sanctuary. People guard the story of the Vikings because it feels powerful. It is a story of strength, exploration, and a clear identity. But the DNA proves that the identity was never clear-cut. When you look at the 442 genomes, the cartoon version of the Viking dissolves. In its place, you see the Salme brothers, terrified and loyal, dying together on a beach in Estonia. You see the Orkney warrior, born of Pictish blood but buried with Norse honor because he earned it. You see the trader in Gotland, bringing a wife from the east whose children would grow up speaking Norse but carrying Uralic genes. The Viking was not a single face. It was a job, a role, and a network. It was a culture you could join if you were willing to pay the price in risk. If you stop at the helmet and the sword, you keep the false image. You keep the idea that biology is destiny. If you keep watching, you get the reward. The Vikings were a mixed, connected, and complicated human world. They were families who tried to survive, villages that tried to expand, and people who crossed lines that we think are permanent. The man with the sword in Orkney forces us to admit that culture is stronger than blood. The brothers in Salme force us to see that raids were driven by love and loyalty as much as greed. And the brown hair in the sample forces us to drop the costume and look at the person. Eske Willerslev looks at the tooth again. The stereotype cannot survive the crowd of evidence. The DNA, pulled from the hardest parts of the body, does what sagas and movies never could. It brings the Vikings back as people, mixed, connected, and often brown-haired. The Viking you carry in your head is famous, but he never existed. The real Vikings were far more interesting. They were a diverse collection of people who shared a lifestyle, not just a bloodline. They moved outward and they pulled the world inward. And in the end, the most Viking thing about them was not their purity, but their refusal to stay in one place, either on the map or in their genes.